As you may know, Hurricane Harvey just hit Texas and so many Texans have been flooded out of their houses. I'm coming to you from McCoy's Building Supply today, and we're going to give you the 5 steps you need to clean up after a flood. If you've had a flood at your house or you're helping friends or neighbors with their flooded house, this video is going to give you the 5 steps you need to clean up and get those people back on their feet. All right, let's get started. So the very first step, we want to focus on safety first. We want to cut off all the power to the house and cut off the gas lines as well. As we're working in the house, we don't want anybody getting hurt. And speaking of your body, a few things about personal protection you need to be thinking about. Number one, and probably the most important, is your lungs. We want to wear a safety mask. We're going to be creating dust, there's going to be mold, there may even be some lead if there's an older house. So at a minimum, you want to have an N95 mask like this. Even better is a P100 half-face respirator like this. These are going to protect your lungs, which is vital. The other thing you're going to want to do, probably if there's still wetness in there, is wear some rubber boots or at least some work boots. You want to get a good pair of gloves to wear to protect your hands from cuts and abrasions. And you also want to wear safety glasses, especially as we start talking about some of the chemicals you might be using later on in this process. So work safe. Okay, number 2, this is the big step here. This is the demo phase. Anything that's gotten wet in the house, depending on how big of a flood we're talking about, is probably going to have to get out and trashed. Now, if this is a flood from rising waters and you've got silt in the house, I would tell you you're probably not going to save your carpet. And depending how long it's been underwater, hardwood floors and other type of flooring is going to get severely damaged and probably is going to need trashed as well. On the other hand, if your flood was from a washer and dryer or something that was clean water, some of those may be saved, especially if you're able to clean up very quickly. But if things have been underwater for 2 or 3 days, there's going to be a lot more demo and trash out needed. Hard surfaces like concrete and tile floors, bare studs, all those things are going to be able to dry. So we want to take it back to those hard surfaces so that then we can start the drying process. A couple tips on demo. Look for the flood line in the house. That's the area the water got to. If you had a 1-foot flood line, you typically want to go a foot above that and start your demo from there down. Anything that's gotten wet and saturated with water is either going to need to be trashed, or we definitely need to get it dry as quickly as possible. Typically, I like to recommend cutting your sheetrock a foot above. You can do that in several ways. You can score it several times with a knife. You could also use a chalk line to get a nice straight line on there, and then you could cut it with a circular saw or other methods, but that's going to create a lot of dust, and we want to cut down on the dust as much as possible. So your best bet is to use a knife. Now, when it comes to cabinets, depending on the type of cabinets you have, they may be able to be saved. If they're older cabinets that are made of real plywood, they probably can be dried, but cabinets on exterior walls, we need access to the back of those cabinets so we can dry out the stud bays. You might consider using a rotozip tool or a Dremel tool, something that you can cut lightly on the back of the cabinet to get that plywood backing off and have access to the sheetrock and the insulation that's behind it, but you can leave the bulk of the cabinet in place. Now, if you've got island cabinets or other built-ins that got wet that don't have insulation behind them, at a minimum, you want to get access to the underside of the cabinet or the toe kick area. One way you can do that is with your drill and a spade bit. You can drill a series of holes right near the ground at the toe kick area. You want to space those out every couple of inches, and you want to make sure you've got good airflow and access to underneath those cabinets. So drill those holes all the way around at the base. We can put a molding on that later to disguise this, but we're trying to get airflow in there, get any standing water out, and get it as clean and dry underneath those cabinets as possible. Sheetrock in general though, once it's gotten wet and has been in a floodwater area, you want to go ahead and demo it out. You really can't save it. Any trim that's solid wood, you might be able to save that, so use a pry bar and be gentle on trim. If it's real wood, like I mentioned, it's probably going to be able to dry. If it's MDF or particle board or one of those other man-made styles, it's probably going to blow up. You're going to have to trash that. When it comes to insulation, anything that's gotten wet needs to come out. Here's what I recommend. Go a foot above where the flood line was and verify that the insulation is dry in that location, and then use a knife, and you want to actually cut that insulation and make sure where you're cutting is a dry portion. Now be cautious not to yank down that insulation or pull it out of the cavity, because then later you're going to have a void up there. We want to just cut it where it's dry, pull that bottom section out, and then that is going to give everything the ability to dry, and that insulation's trash. You're going to want to replace that later with new insulation. I also want to mention on interior doors, take your doors off and take them outside to dry. A lot of doors are going to be able to dry out and be salvaged. When it comes to the door jambs, leave the jambs in place, but take the trim off. That way everything can dry out and you won't have to rehang new doors. That's a really good tip for you. Okay, now that step 2, which is the demo phase, is complete, the house has been trashed out, you've got everything from the flood line and down out, or at least everything that's still there we believe could be dried out. The next step is the cleanup. We're really going for a white glove clean. Now, if you've had a flood event and you've had standing water in your house, believe it or not, a garden hose is a great way to go here. If you've got silt in the house, you could actually take your hose in, clean all that silt out, even hose down areas that have gotten wet before. What we're trying to do is get bacteria or anything that was in that standing flood water out of your house, get the silt out. We really want to get your house as clean as possible in this stage. It's vital to clean it up because we potentially have bacteria and mold and other things that have been growing in there. We want to get all that out and get it as clean as possible. The next step after you've done that thorough clean is to do a disinfection process. Now, the easiest way to do that, and probably the least cost way, is to use some bleach. We want to use about a half cup of bleach to a gallon, and then we're going to use a 2-gallon pump sprayer like this one that McCoy sells. We're going to mix all that together in the pump sprayer, and we're going to wet down every surface in the house that's gotten wet. All of your stud bays, all the insides of your cabinets, all of your floors, anything in the house that's gotten wet, we want to go ahead and do a light disinfection. Now remember, bleach is caustic, so we want to be really cautious, wear eye protection and gloves. Get the kids out of the house while you do this. And also, don't wet down metal things. So if you got wiring that got wet, don't spray the wiring down. Everything else we want to put a bleach solution on, but don't spray metal because it's going to corrode with that bleach. Step 4, we want to dry the house down. This is vital. We want to make sure that everything that's gotten wet is getting as dry as possible. A couple ways to do this. We can definitely use fans throughout the house. Any areas, especially cabinetry or places that are hard to access, blow that air in there and get as much airflow through those areas as possible. You can also use a dehumidifier in your house. That's going to help pull that moisture out. You can also use your air conditioner if that's that time of year that you can use the AC. But if it's nice outside or if you've got low humidity, open the windows and doors, get lots of airflow through the house. Let's get that house dry. And remember, we don't want to rebuild the house until we know it's absolutely dry. So if you don't have a piece of test equipment, which is number 5 here, to verify, make sure you wait at least a couple of weeks before you put everything together. Okay, step 5, verify. If you have access to it or if you can afford one at McCoy's, buy a moisture meter. These are going to be able to put a pin into the lumber and tell us what % moisture content we are. We don't want to rebuild until we're about 20% or below, ideally 16% or below on all the wood in the house. The drier, the better. And as we're talking about this, the last step is to do a mold control step. Now, there's a couple different products out there, but the one that McCoy sells that's really easy to use is Concrobium. Again, you're going to use your 2-gallon pump sprayer, follow the directions in the bottle, and we're going to wet down all the surfaces in the house. Now, we're not worried about concrete in this case, but we do want to wet down all the lumber, all the cabinets, anything that's gotten wet that might be a source of mold in the future. Now, while we're talking about mold, let me take a minute to give you some practical advice on mold. Anytime we have a flood, there's lots of news about mold. Mold has been with us forever. Remember, you've got it growing in your bathroom right now. If you watch the news, they talk about the mold count in the air. If you're a healthy adult, there's nothing to be afraid of with some mold exposure. On the other hand, if you've got a compromised immune system or kids, they can have a lot less exposure to mold before they're going to start having some allergy-like symptoms, and that's what happens with adults as well. Things like stuffy noses, runny eyes, all those kinds of things are symptoms of potentially a high mold exposure. After we've had a flood event, mold's going to grow in just 2 or 3 days, but after you've demoed everything out and dried it, especially after we've done a mold control process like that Concrobium, we don't have to worry about that anymore. Mold needs 3 things to grow. It needs heat, which is happening all over in Texas. There's nothing we can do about heat. It needs a food source, which our houses have lots of food sources. The more broken down the wood is, the easier mold is to grow on it. In other words, the back of your sheetrock, the back of your MDF cabinets or trim, those are going to have a lot more potential for mold growth than your 2x4s or your concrete slab. But remember, the third thing that mold needs to grow is a water source. Now, when your house was flooded out, if it had been flooded for 2 or 3 days, you probably found some mold growth while you were demoing things out. You've gotten rid of that, we've cleaned up, we've disinfected, and we've hopefully used an anti-mold product at the very last step. Now the house has been dry for a few weeks, there's no more concerns about mold growth. We've taken away that final thing that mold needs to grow, so you're safe at this point. Guys, it's easy for me to talk to you about this in my dry store with all the equipment around me, but I know if you're watching this video, you're probably either going or have gone through a terrible time. I want you to know that the McCoy's family and I are praying for you. Please visit your local McCoy store for any of the supplies that we talked about today, and take this time to pray and connect with the Lord. Remember Philippians 4:19, God wants to supply your needs. Pray specifically for those things and He's going to provide for you. God bless you.